It's my pleasure to introduce Gayle Walker today. She is our first speaker as part of the Faculty Scholars Development Committee's lecture series for this year. And probably you already know some things about Gayle's work here, but I took a look at your website and I learned some things I hadn't known about you. But she is a teacher, a conductor, a performer, a vocalist, an adjudicator, a clinician, and as we're here today, a composer. And I also want to say, not only as Gayle's colleague, but as an Otterbein mom, when my daughter was an undergraduate here, she was in choir for 4 years, and she learned so much from Gayle, and she and I both had the pleasure, when she was a senior, to travel with Gayle and Craig Johnson and the concert choir to Switzerland and to France, and it was unforgettable. It was really fun to be in Paris with Gayle musically and in every way. So today she's going to talk about her recent sabbatical project, which was to compose a multi-movement choral music composition using name poems by Dayton native poet Paul Laurence Dunbar. And she's going to talk about conducting this also with the Otterbein Concert Choir.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thanks for coming. I'll try to change things as we go, given the number of people are here, which is great. It's no problem. I'm just glad you're here. Patty's title, which is what I'd originally turned in for this project, changed quite a bit. She mentioned name poems, and that completely changed by the time I finished. So I'll talk through that as well. But the final outcome of this composition project was 3 songs that I composed for SATB choir on the poems of Paul Laurence Dunbar. And the goal was to have concert choir premiere them here in Westerville, and then soon after take them on tour. Every year we do a domestic tour, and last spring when they performed these works, and actually I composed it in the fall of 13. I can't get 2014 out of my head, so it was fall of 13. But concert choir performed the works on this past spring of 2014 on our tour to Chicago. So I thought I'd tell you a little bit about how the project evolved, because what I ended up with was not what I proposed at all. And another faculty member in the music department was on sabbatical at the same time, and she's a professional composer. I'm a professional conductor who's learning how to be a composer. So Jenny and I met and talked quite a bit about how we were going to balance this. We were both doing composition projects. She is the consummate master at composition. I'm the student who started late in composition, and I wanted to make sure that the works we did were fulfilling to the choir, that we didn't step on each other's toes and end up doing similar types of works, and that the length of the works were something that the choir could handle, and that the difficulty of our composing, or difficulty of the outcome, was something the choir could handle. So we had a number of meetings to discuss that. We were trying to figure out how to do 2 extended works on one concert program, and if that was going to be okay for the choir. It's not as varied as I usually do, because they need to learn about a wide variety of styles. We also talked about the Humor and Music Festival, because that was held here in the department last year, and it was held in April. Our tour was in March, but the Humor and Music program was in April, so we had to decide, are we composing only for the choir, or are we composing for Humor and Music Festival? Do we want to do humorous works? Does one of us do humorous works? Do we both? It was a little it was different, trying to plan a sabbatical and make sure that I was not stepping on somebody else's toes. And originally, when I presented a proposal to the sabbatical committee, I thought I would compose a work based on some name poems, and I wanted to do that because I thought it sounded like fun. I wanted to find poetry about particular people, and I wanted to capture the personalities of those people in music, and I thought it'd be fun to do character compositions. So I started looking for name poems. And Dunbar, Paul Laurence Dunbar, has some name poems that are based on particular people in his life. And I found those and then started to read his other poems as well. So that's how I was introduced to Dunbar. And in addition to doing the name poems, I also wanted to study composition with Libby Larson, who's a highly respected composer, really internationally. We got to know her a few years ago when she visited Otterbein. And then as I started studying more about Dunbar and reading more of his poetry, I realized, gee, I really like his poetry. And this is really has the feel of what I'm sort of looking for. Even though he has two different styles of poetry. One is just romantic European poetic style, and the other one is in dialect of the African American style at the time. So they're very, very different. And I've just read through his poetry and learned about his life, and I thought, gee, this is amazing. He was an African American writer in Dayton. And in the second half of the 19th century, we had on campus an abolitionist composer, Benjamin Hanby, and I was wondering, gee, is there some way I can combine their works, combine their artworks? Now that I look back on it, I think that may have been a little bit harebrained because it was really hard to do. And I'm not sure the connection was close enough or firm enough, but that kind of just the wheels were spinning. And then as I read more of his poems, I decided I just like Paul Laurence Dunbar's poems. I want to use those poems. And specifically, there were three that really drew my attention that I thought were very powerful works. Sympathy, We Wear the Mask, and Beyond the Years. So that was I gave up on names altogether and just found meaningful poems by Paul Laurence Dunbar. And I'll talk about his life in a minute because it's pretty remarkable. This is Libby Larson, and I thought I would say something about her because she has become my composition teacher. And it's thanks to Otterbein that she is, because it was through our enrichment series that she came on campus. She was a visiting composer for a week in 2006, and we all loved her. She's an amazing teacher. She's dynamic. She's a very liberal arts musician. She sees the world around her, incorporates it all into her music, brings it all into the music, and her commentary with the students had that kind of perspective. What is happening in the world today? What are you bringing into your music? So after she left Otterbein, I thought this would be a wonderful person to study with. And so when I've had subsequent sabbaticals, the first one was 8 years ago, I contacted her, said, will you be my teacher? I'm a beginning composer. And she said, yes. And I dropped the phone and fell over. She's pretty amazing. So just because I really feel like it's thanks to Otterbein that I got to know her and made this connection with her. I thought I'd say something about her. As I said, she was a featured guest for the Department of Music's Women Composers Enrichment Series event. She's had over 500 works in every genre, in every type of composition you can imagine. She's even composed 16 operas. So she's very, very busy. She's won a Grammy. She founded the Minnesota Composers Forum, which became the American Composers Forum. And she's had residencies with major orchestras around the country. She's been commissioned by artists around the world. So I just felt so fortunate that I had that opportunity. And really, it was because she met me here that she was willing to do that. It meant I had to fly to where she was. So that was part of the project, was traveling to find Libby. And this is Paul Laurence Dunbar. He is actually from Dayton, and I had heard of him, but I didn't realize that he was an Ohio native. He has written over 400 poems, also novels, short stories, song lyrics. Someday I'm going to have to set some of his song lyrics, operettas, so very diverse writer. And he was one of the first African-American writers to gain national attention. His parents were former slaves from Shelbyville, Kentucky. And it's believed that his mother married a man who was a slave by the same master. So they were on the plantation there together. He went to Central High School in Dayton, and I found that amazing, that in the late 19th century, he was the only African American in his graduating class. Orville Wright was in his graduating class. And I read that his mother was the washerwoman to the Wright family, so they knew each other very well. And actually, Orville helped support him, probably gave him a little bit of money to help him publish his first collection of poems. He was president of his class. He was editor of his newspaper. He was titled Poet Laureate of his class. So he was highly regarded when he was in high school. But it was not an easy time. So after graduation, this incredibly promising young man who he had hoped to go to Harvard and study law, after graduation he tried to get a job with the Dayton newspaper, and they wouldn't hire him because he was African American. So instead he took a job as an elevator operator. So that must have been quite a shock for him to go from a high school that was pretty supportive of him into the real world where he couldn't get a decent job and could not go to Harvard because of his race. In 1893, he traveled to the World's Fair in Chicago. He was hoping to make connections there that might lead to promising employment, and he did. He met Frederick Douglass, and Frederick Douglass had a Haitian exhibit at the World's Fair in Chicago, and Paul Dunbar worked there for Frederick Douglass. So he did know Frederick Douglass, and Frederick Douglass did invite him to meet other folks, so kind of helped him get his name out there. And then a few years later, he was working at the Library of Congress. At that time, he was married. They say that was not easy work for him because he developed tuberculosis, and the dust in the stacks complicated that and made that more difficult for him. And his tuberculosis eventually got so bad that he was just in pain, and so he became an alcoholic. Frequently you read that this was his way of managing the tuberculosis, so I'll assume that was the case. But in any case, he became a pretty serious alcoholic, and he and his wife divorced. And then in the last few years of his life, in the early 1900s, he returned to Dayton. He was 31 when he came back to Dayton, and he lived with his mother and died in her home at the age of 33. And his mother was a huge promoter of his works after death, and maintained his room as it was when he died. And their house is in Dayton. It's a museum. I have not gotten there. I've been planning to go. I have not gotten there, but apparently very little has changed in his room. So it's an interesting story, and it's nearby. It's close to Otterbein. That is his mother. That's Matilda Dunbar, and that is Paul Laurence Dunbar sitting with her. And this is the first poem that I set. It's very famous. Maya Angelou made the first line famous because she entitled her autobiography, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, and so a lot of people assume that she wrote that poem. But it was Paul Laurence Dunbar who wrote it, and she borrowed that line from him. And it opens with a very pastoral feel. The sun is shining, the wind is gently stirring, the river is flowing, the perfume is going through the meadow, and yet, as Paul Laurence Dunbar says, I know what the caged bird feels. The second stanza is quite a contrast. It's a shock, I thought, when I read it. I thought it was quite a shock. I know why the caged bird beats his wing till its blood is red on the cruel bars. So he doesn't waste much time before he gets to some violence. And the pain still throbs in the old scars. They pulse again with a keener sting. I know why he beats his wing. So you get a deeper understanding of what's happening with this bird. And then in the third stanza, we move from what I would call violence to emotional pain and emotional scarring. I know why the caged bird sings. When his wing is bruised, bosom sore, he beats his bars, and he would be free. It's not a carol of joy or glee, but a prayer that he sends from his heart's deep core, a plea that upward to heaven he flings. I know why the caged bird sings. So pleading with heaven to be free. So it's pretty obvious that he was writing about the African American condition in the late 19th century, and it's obvious to me that Dunbar was well acquainted with this kind of pain. It had to have been apparent to him that he was celebrated in high school and then had a very hard time being accepted after high school. His high school was uniquely open-minded, I think. I don't know anything about Central High School at that time, but that's what I would guess. So he understood this pain. So this was the first movement of my composition. And I thought I would talk a little bit about how I and other composers take the written word and express meaning through our music, highlight the word, bring it into perhaps a different color of meaning. We want to stay true to the text, but we try to deepen the text as much as we can. And these are some of the ways that I did that, and that Libby Larson, my teacher, encouraged me to do it. First of all, you can use your music to highlight the character aspect of the work. So in my mind, there were two characters in this poem. There's Dunbar, I know why the caged bird sings, and his association with those kinds of feelings. But I also think that he was speaking for all of us, or all people who are repressed, all people who are not getting a fair shake. And then the second character is the caged bird. What's it like to be the individual that's going through this drama? In his poem, The Bird. So I was thinking about a cage. What would that be like? And in music, the interval of a fourth, which is like from C to F, has kind of a hollow feeling, hollow sound. You can invert it, make it F to C, and it's a perfect fifth. That's hollow because we have to add a third to make a chord. And then there's a richness that's familiar to all of our ears. This is haunting, open, hollow, was used a lot in the Middle Ages, the open fifth and the open fourth both. So when I was thinking about the cage and how the cage had spaces to see through, I wanted to use the fourth and the fifth, because I thought of those intervals as being the bars on the cage. Very hollow, you can see through them. And then the bird is trapped almost inside of those intervals. So that, let's see, that's on this page. Here, I'll show that. So here, the opening melody starts with a fourth, and then has a falling fourth at the end as well. So that became a motive, the fourth, to start a phrase and end a phrase. And then I made sure that if I was addressing Dunbar's perspective, or as I worked on this piece, what I started to believe was he was speaking for humanity, people who are in this situation, that it had a broader perspective. That was the choir. And so I just put a little snippet from the choir there, but a plea that upward to heaven he flings. And then I added a flute so that the flute would be the caged bird. And the flute enters in between the choir and brings out a psychological drama that evolves over time in the composition. So the opening flute statement There's the falling fourth there, or falling fifth. Fourth up, fifth. So that was the opening of the flute, which is caged and angry. And then the next entrance of the flute, in my mind, the bird is searching for a way to get free. And again, the raising fourth and the falling fourth. And then the next entrance, the bird is struggling to be free, beating the bars against the cage, beating the wings against the cage of the bars of the cage. And then at the end of the piece, unfortunately, the bird is resigned because there isn't resolution at the end of this poem. It calls up to heaven for freedom, but it's not delivered. And so I made a note to the flutist to play it with resignation. And that's how that ends.
So did you say how many instruments this was composed for? Is it
Flute and choir.
flute and choir?
Mm-hmm. And then there are some other things that I did to represent the text. Tied notes in that section there represents clinging to the perch. So that sounds like this. So you hold on, you sing the notes, you hold on to them, you don't let go of them while you're clinging. And then I knew that the more violent text, blood, red on the cruel bars, that I wanted to bring more dissonance, more crashes like this into the piece. That's a very traditional way for composers to bring forth pain in a composition, is to have a lot of dissonance. So it just made perfect sense. And the third staff down there, right there, that's the tenor staff. And the first tenor is singing a C, second tenor is singing a B flat, and then the second alto is singing a D against it. So those three voices are completely dissonant against each other, and the chord sounds like this. I wasn't happy with that at first. I thought it sounded too pretty, but it's what I came up with. And I think it's effective enough in the piece. Okay. So I thought we would listen to each one after I talk about them a little bit. So this is Sympathy, with concert choir performing. Sean Brewster is our flutist. He's a senior this year. I left a line out here. It's a river. and then it goes on from there. We probably won't have time to play everything. Let's see from the current slide. So that's the first movement. As I was composing this, I began to have Sean Brewster in mind because in the spring he performed on a student recital, and it was a very, the piece that he played had, I felt, a lot of imagery in it. It didn't, the composition was not titled anything from real life. It was a sonatina, but it had a lot of contemporary sound effects in it, and he poured his heart into that piece, and I could just imagine scenes, images as the piece went by. So I started to compose this for Sean and emailed him after I started that first movement and said, Sean, I think I'm writing a piece that would be just perfect for you to play. Are you up for this, and can you go on tour with us? Because he wasn't in choir at that time, and he said, sure, I'd be happy to. He's a wonderful student, so bright and so talented, and I said, I'm not sure how well it's going to go, so keep an open mind, and we'll see what I give you in the end. And he said, sure thing. So I ended up composing the piece for him, which was really fun. He's a great student. It was great to team with him that way. This was the second poem that I set, which is pretty famous. I had heard of it before I found this anthology of poems on Dunbar. And it's pretty obvious, I think, what's happening here. We wear the mask that grins and lies, but with torn and bleeding hearts we smile. This mask is here, but we're not allowed to show how we feel on the inside. We're not allowed to show who we really are. We have to be who society expects us to be. And that was something the students could relate to very well. We talked quite a bit about that as we were performing and learning the pieces. Very emotional in the last stanza. We smile, but oh great Christ, our cries, a call out to Christ. To thee from tortured souls, torturous. And Dunbar lived this. So this is what was in his heart in the late 19th century. We sing, but oh, the clay is vile beneath our feet, and long the mile. In other words, we drag ourselves through life as we're wearing this mask. Let the world dream otherwise, that we're happy and content, but we know better because we wear the mask. And as I composed it, this was sort of the type of mask I had in mind, something that was rough-hewn with, angular nose. I wanted something that was hard-edged, and so that type of mask is what I had in mind. Hard to wear, not comfortable for the person wearing it. And as I was composing it, I decided that I wanted different layers of meaning. I wanted the person behind the mask to be one, and then I wanted the other characterization to be the mask that person is wearing. And so they should sound different. So I assigned the mask component to the alto, second soprano, alto, tenor, and bass. They were the mask. And if you have a roughly hewn mask, and any mask, you've got holes, you can see the person coming through it. So that person should be, the real person should be shining through the mask somehow. And so I made that the soprano and the tenor, which presented lots of problems for balance. I like the idea, but if we were to perform it again, I'd have to go back and work on balance issues so that those two parts wouldn't be buried by the mask. Oops. So again, I wanted to think of a mask that was very hard, confining, static. And so I used a lot of repeated notes in the composition of this movement. Yet the person behind the mask is very much alive and feeling and warm. And so I wanted sort of a sweeping lyrical line for the person behind the mask. I also made sure that I still used open fourths and fifths because, like the bars of the cage, I think that they have a harshness to them. They have a hard edge. So the soprano and alto, that represents the mask, along with the tenor line underneath. And it's dissonant in two voices, but an open fourth in the others. Like that. And then the soprano, I didn't copy the entire score because it was a little too thick, but the soprano and tenor have the lyrical line, which is the third staff there. And this is how that one sounds when you put it together. So that's the end of the previous. Oops. There it is. So that's the second movement, a little taste of that. Okay, and then the third movement is called Beyond the Years. And this is actually from a three-part poem that Dunbar wrote. There's a first stanza that's completely separate, which has a numeral 1 by it, and second stanza that's completely separate, and a third stanza. This is the third stanza. They all have the theme Beyond the Years. This one I chose because it had the greatest resolution to it, and so that I thought that it provided a glimpse of what he thought hope was. And it says, as you can see, beyond the years the soul shall find that endless peace for with it, which it pined, for light appears. And to the eyes that still were blind with blood and tears, their sight shall come all unconfined beyond the years. And I felt that that really spoke to his life. He died at the age of 33, and it was not in his life that racial tension and lack of respect for all kinds of people in this world, in our country, was resolved. It's still not resolved. It's still not quite answered. He may have been thinking beyond the years when perhaps he was thinking when I get to heaven. When I first read this, I thought, maybe we're almost there. His beyond the years, maybe we're almost there. Obama is our president. That's something that's been something to celebrate. But we're not there yet. We still have problems. So this does, when I composed this, I had the feeling of hope and resolution in mind. So I went ahead and followed that instinct. And so I saw this movement as a resolution of the struggle. And I brought the bird back so the bird could feel that resolution. And I wanted it to be the most simple of the movements, very folk-like, very singable, very easy to listen to. And there's the flute. And the flute, when it comes in, it has, again, motives from the opening. This rising fourth, jumps up a fourth, and then falls the fourth, and then reaches further there, but falls a fourth. So I wanted to bring those fourths back. But the men, when they sing, it's just very, very simple and folk-like. And then I wanted there to be a climax of the entire composition in this movement. And I chose that in the last few lines, Beyond the Years. I chose to repeat those lines because I thought they were very important, and moved into the key of F sharp major, which is a very bright sounding key. And that's what that is showing there. And so we'll go ahead and listen to that one to move ahead. Oh, I turned it down, didn't I? F sharp major here. And that's the end. That's all three movements. Yeah, it was an interesting process and very gratifying to work with my own students on it. It was, we felt pretty close, I think, through the whole process. And they loved Dr. Merkowitz's works. And I presented to the student body 2 weeks ago on this piece, because I hadn't presented it to the department outside of the concert. And I asked the students, did you feel like it was too much premiering two long, large works in the same concert by two contemporary composers? And it was difficult, very difficult music. And they said no. They were thrilled. No one thought it was too much to do that. And that was my big concern through the whole thing, is that we were hitting them with too much, two composers all at once. So, are there any questions?
I never knew all that was involved with music, because I am very ignorant about music and composing, but oh my gosh, the sounds on the piano, you could feel those sounds.
Right.
And to somebody like you that understands all that, it's just amazing that you're able to put all that together.
Yeah. Well, and the fourth and the fifth have been used in those ways throughout history. I mean, they have a harder edge to them. So when you study music history, you learn these things, and they're not a secret in history. So we borrow from the past and use them today too.
Once you had decided on these poems, how long did it take you to do the composition?
A long time, and it took me a long time to choose the poems. I kept waiting for a poem to jump out at me and say, compose me, and that didn't happen for a long time. These works did finally, but it really was painstaking to make them work. The only one that felt relatively easy was the last movement. And it was meant to be easy. It was meant to be easy for the audience to assimilate.
Do you have a computer program that allows you to hear a flute as you're composing, or that's not even important?
No,
You just use the piano?
there are computer programs that MIDI allows you to listen to various instruments.
As you're composing, you're listening to how certain things.
Well, it's very interesting. I'm sure there are plenty of composers who do that. Libby Larson tells me not to do that.
So you're hearing it just in your head.
And she said at one point, are you listening to the computer a lot? And I said, well, I don't know what a lot is, but a few times. And she said, stop that. Because then the computer starts leading you. And it doesn't lead you in an intelligent direction. You know, you think, oh, okay, I'll just sit at the computer and tweak here and tweak there and go wherever I feel like going after that. And that's not intelligent design. So, yeah, Terry?
You use metaphor a lot when you describe music, which is a very poetic device. And I like how the three are very different metaphorically in some of the references to the gap between the fourth and the notes, and then other places like the vestment standing for pain or for
Right.
anguish. And then in the third one, it is satisfying, right? It's like you say, melodic, but also there's something really sweet about it feels like a round. It feels like it's being sung as a round. Would you say that's metaphorical also? In the sense that voices woven together feel more whole? Were you thinking metaphorically when you got to that spot?
It's the only movement that the flute and the singers are together. Together. It's a discant above the voices. So in that sense, that comes together. I used it's not a formula, but it's a type of composition that I've sung a lot in arrangements of American hymns, where the men have the melody, then the women come in and provide atmospheric ooze, and then the women have the melody, and then they all come together that way. And what's nice about it in this piece is that everyone joins together at the end, so that there's this natural progression towards that unification and resolution at the end. So I wouldn't say that I made up that technique for the piece, but it worked really, really well.
Well, it seems very metaphorical.
Yeah,
musically
yeah.
Metaphorical, and I wonder if there is a certain tradition of that being providing a sense of harmony or completeness, or because the other two pieces are about dissonance.
Right.
And suddenly you've got this nice weaving,
Right.
which symbolizes, I'm assuming, many other things.
Yeah, and it's a very commonly used composition technique. And I think because it's so satisfying and because it does have the direction of, okay, we're introducing this melody, another voice sings it again, and then we sing it all together, so we're joined at the end. So it's used a lot.
Now, is there a venue for you to, I don't know what the word for it is, like publish these so that another choir director could actually like see this as a kind of thing that they would want their students or some other professional choir to sing.
That's what I would like to do. It's now it's a question of time. It took the entire sabbatical to complete them and prepare the scores for the choir. So, and then when I came back, we rehearsed them. And I had thought this summer maybe I can polish them up, and because there's some things I'd want to change before I publish them.
There are some things you need.
Yeah, I wasn't happy with the balance of the second movement. I liked what I did, but it just didn't, and it was so much more difficult than I wanted it to be for the singers. I don't quite have control of that yet.
I thought the second one, there was something kind of mechanical in the we wear the mask, we wear the mask, we wear the mask, very mechanical, repetitive, and then the other one was, I don't know what the term for it is, it was more human, it had much
Right.
more duration in between, and that was the part that I think was the part, the human being behind the mask, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah, so you heard, that was the goal.
What was out of balance, I guess, is it that you felt like the first one was too, I don't even know the musical terms, but is it like too loud or it's too?
Right, that the mask, there were so many more voices singing the mask character that it could overpower the lyrical line, and we had to work really hard on that. Change the voices, okay, you leave this line, go to that, you leave that line, go to that, and I'm just wondering how much patience conductors have to deal with that. I'd rather have the score just make it work like that right from the start.
So you talked a little bit about the details of some of your processes. Do you have overall, do you have the same sort of approach when you're composing, or do you, once you've selected something, is it that you think about the overall style and the feelings you want to get out, and then think about what chords might match up to what phrases and then piece it together, or does it?
Right.
Does your approach differ for each composition, or?
Right now it's similar for the I've had 2 sabbaticals that I've composed, and it's been similar for both. And Libby, I think, has kind of encouraged me along those lines. And the first thing I do is I make a copy of the text so that I can study it and write on it. And I might do some analysis of the poem. You know, these are 2 parts that mirror each other. The rhyme is the same here, so I want similar melodies there. And then I'll make notes on the text about what kind of harmonies I want in that place, which voices I want in that place, what instrumentation I want there. Do I want to add flute? So I'll make notes on the text itself, and then I'll sit down at the piano and improvise based on those ideas I've written down, and I'll improvise. And then once I've improvised and come up with some ideas that I think work, then I sit down at the table and try to put it on paper. And the challenge is holding it in your brain. Experienced composers who've been doing this all their lives for profession, they just hear it all in their head. So that's a building process. I'm getting to that point.
Do you record yourself ever and then listen to it, or?
I've thought of that, but I haven't, because it's kind of time consuming. The computer can do that. So it's so tempting to just push a button and say, how effective is this? And so I do that, but she's right. And my teacher caught me at it, and she was right. Yeah, I got caught. The composition started controlling me instead of the other way around. So.
Dunbar composed
Thank you,
music
Terry.
himself.
Pardon me?
Dunbar composed music himself. I saw he had.
Well, we have his published texts, so I believe he did write songs, but we don't have the staff
So there's
notation.
no, evidence that he might have put these songs, these poems to music.
I'm guessing he didn't, because I've not read that he had any musical background. He probably sang them himself, wrote down the words, and they're repetitive, like 19th century, music was, and he probably just sang it and kept track of the words and had the melodies in his head. But maybe he knew how to notate it. I don't know. Yeah.
That's great.
Very good.
It's so nice of you to come. Thank you. Thank you.
It's interesting, Shakespeare has all those songs too.
Yeah.
They're not notated in that way. And clearly the actors sung them.
Right.
So somebody had
to have.
whether they actually wrote it with the staff, like you're saying, or whether it was just somebody who hadn't heard it in their head.
I read once that Thomas Morley, who's a famous Renaissance composer, lived around the corner from Shakespeare in London. And for It Was a Lover and His Lass, we have Morley's compositions on that text. So there's speculation that he wrote that for the play, but we don't know.
was struck too, looking at these musical lines and parts, and you know, that the music itself is a metaphor for what he's trying to express, not just hearing it, but the notes are trying to hit out.
That's right, yeah.
And
That's,
sometimes they succeed and sometimes they don't, and sometimes they fall below, and it was odd just to see that parallel. when
That's really
you
interesting,
about the
yeah.
choices you made, you know. So,
yeah.
well, thank you.
Thanks for coming.
Sure.